Are you interested in redeemable shares and want to understand how they work? I'm Malcolm Zoppi, an English qualified solicitor, and in this video, we'll discuss redeemable shares. We will go over three main things. First, what are redeemable shares? Second, why are redeemable shares used? And lastly, how can redeemable shares be redeemed? How do they actually work? Fantastic, let's get started. So chapter 1 is, what are redeemable shares? So in short, redeemable shares are shares that the company that issued or created those shares can buy back from its investors, and or depending on how they're structured, the investor can also decide to request that the company buy those shares back from the investor. So that means that they are redeemable either at the command or request of the company or the investor. There are three main factors that we need to consider when thinking about redeemable shares. First is, again, who can make the decision or who can make the request that those shares be redeemed. Second, what price is to be paid for those shares when the company buys them back from the investor. And lastly, what are the terms, or when can the relevant party enforce those provisions? So what terms are attached to the redemption rights? As a pro tip, always make sure to document the different classes of shares that the company has, including redeemable shares, in the company's articles of association. And you also want to make sure that the company's articles allow for the company to buy back its shares, because if the company's articles do not allow for that to be the case, then the company cannot issue or create those shares in the first place. Fantastic. Now let's move on to chapter 2, which is, why are redeemable shares used? So what are the advantages, and in what scenarios are these shares typically used? So advantages is that they offer flexibility for both companies and investors. Second, companies can raise capital, so equity capital, without permanently giving up control, because typically redeemable shares or redeemable preference shares do not carry any voting rights. Then investors get a guaranteed exit strategy with clear terms despite investing in shares. And lastly, it's kind of like debt. It's kind of like giving a loan or receiving a loan, in the sense that the company has to repay the loan back by buying back the shares at some point in the future. And instead of paying interest, the company pays dividends, and typically those dividends are paid at a fixed rate, just like interest is on a loan. So my pro tip, especially to a company, will be that you might want to consider using redeemable shares, typically structured as redeemable preference shares. When you're looking to raise capital, you want to take on money, but for example, you don't want to have any charges on the company. You're not able to have any charges, additional charges on your company's house profile, maybe because you already have charges there. And you also want more flexibility when it comes to taking on capital investments. Now, before we discuss how the redemption mechanism actually works, feel free to email me if looking for professional legal advice. With our legal advice calls, there are no charges, no obligations, and no nonsense. Contact me now at info@zopri.co.uk. Fantastic. Now let's move on to chapter 3, which is, how can redeemable shares actually be redeemed? How can they be bought back? What is the mechanism that is used? So firstly, the company is going to have to decide the terms on which they're going to offer these redeemable shares to their investors. Now, investors can decide whether to invest accordingly or not, but it is up to the company, its directors and shareholders, to decide what terms and conditions are attached to those redeemable preference shares. How they arrive at that decision could be, for example, through negotiations with their investors. So as previously mentioned, some of the things that the company is going to have to decide is, number one, who can decide for those shares to be bought back? Is it, for example, the company that whenever it's ready to buy back the shares can decide, okay, now investor, I will take your shares back and I'll give you your money back. Secondly, what price is to be paid on those shares? So, for example, is it going to be the nominal value of the shares as shown on Companies House? Or is it going to be the market value that goes up and down depending on the time of the day and the time of the year, the company's status? Or lastly, is it going to be a predetermined purchase price that the company is bound to honor? If the latter, that could either be the same price that the investor paid for the shares, so effectively you're returning their investment exactly the same, plus dividends, aka interest. or it can be a multiple of their investment. So you could say, I'm not going to give you dividends, but I'll return you 1.5 times the amount of money that you have given me within, let's say, 2 years. Now, something very important to keep in mind is that redeemable shares, when they are redeemed by the company, this will be seen as a buyback, a share buyback that's conducted by the company. Now, share buybacks under the Companies Act 2006 are very strictly regulated. So a very specific process needs to be followed, and the funds, the money that is going to be used to purchase or to fund the buyback is to be closely scrutinized, because different rules apply to different kinds of money that is going to be used to buy back the shares. There are typically three main ways to fund a share buyback. First is out of profits. So if the company has profits to distribute, instead of giving those as dividends to its shareholders, they can use that money to buy back shares from their investors. Option number two is instead to create or issue new shares to, for example, different investors, and use the money that is coming from those different investors to pay the previous investors and buy back their shares. And the last option is to fund the share buyback from capital, so share capital that the company already has. This last option is the most complex and difficult option to choose, because there are strict rules, especially regarding the company's ability to pay back its liabilities, any creditors that it has. Because if you're reducing the share capital of the company, effectively, you're reducing the assets that the company has to pay its creditors if the company is going to be liquidated. So typically that last option is a last resort. So that's how redeemable shares work and how they provide flexible capital to companies looking to grow their business. As always, if you've got any questions, make sure to put them in the comments below. Or if you're interested in learning about preference shares and how they're different to, for example, ordinary shares, make sure to watch this video right here. Thank you for watching.